everyone, and welcome to another episode of Page Turners Plus. The last time you saw us, we were reflecting on The House of Plain Truth by Donna Hemans. As promised, we have Donna with us today, and we'll be interviewing her on her latest novel. Welcome, Donna.
Thank you so much for having me.
It is our pleasure. So, I think to jump off, we could begin with the rationale behind writing this book. So, why is it that you wanted to tell us a story about a Jamaican migrant or Jamaican migrant farm workers in Cuba around the early 20th century?
Well, my grandparents went to Cuba in 1919 and returned to Jamaica in 1931. And, they were, like among, like thousands of Jamaicans who went during that time. And so a part of it was that as a child, I knew just that basic fact that they had gone to Cuba. I know which uncles and aunts were born in Cuba and who was born in Jamaica. But I didn't know anything else beyond that, nothing about the details of their actual life in Cuba. And so, what I wanted to do was to understand that experience, what it was like for them. And so, my grandparents, my grandmother died when I was 16, and my grandfather when I was about 20, 21. So, I never really had an opportunity to ask them questions about that experience. And, I guess like most writers, I write to understand something. So, that really is where this idea for the book came from.
So, in many ways, this is a personal story for you.
It's personal, yeah, because I really I didn't know very much at all about what happened, and when I started doing the research, I was quite surprised about the experience of migrants in Cuba. And I can imagine what it was like for most other people also in Panama because they were there. Most people, well, I shouldn't say most, but a good number of people who went to Cuba went there after the Panama Canal ended and were still looking for work around the Caribbean. So I think there was just so many layers of experiences that we don't hear about, or like we just hear the story about people going off and they're coming back with money to buy land or to do various things, but not a lot of the stories that what the experience really was like for people.
Kasua?
I really love that. As a historian, I interested in that period, early 20th century in the Caribbean. I got really excited by a novel set in that period. There are so few of them, and as you say, the experience of Panama is so crucial, really, to the constructions of what we now think of as West Indian identity in the early 20th century. It was a really special kind of experience. So thank you for the book. But I think the other side of it, of course, is that you have the two sets of migrations, right? You have the migration, the intra-Caribbean migration between Cuba and Jamaica, but also the US-Jamaica link with the later generations. And in both sets of migrations, the migration is traumatic for the people that experience it. And so I think, again, this is something that we know from personal experience, but we don't always see in fiction in the way that you've done it, because it kind of becomes a generational trauma almost. And I wondered if is in some respects your novel is a sort of a warning against migration, or alerts people to the dangers of them beyond the individual, if you like, because I think we know about how people struggle individually, but how a family, how sisters attempt to communicate across migration is really what you tackle in a novel. So is it something that you wanted to raise, the question of whether or not migration had longer generational? I'm sorry, that's such a long question, but hopefully you pulled something out of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is generational trauma in so many different things, but I think for me the bigger issue was really a question about how we as a people just generally and have in the past and even now continue to struggle to find a place to be, a place where we can fully survive, but or I should say fully live without just always struggling to survive. So that to me was the core, and I think early on in the book Perline says pretty much the same thing, that as a people, like she has always looked at her family as always struggling. They struggled to survive in Cuba. Coming back to Jamaica, there was also a different kind of struggle to survive. For her living in America, it was always a struggle to survive. And she just wanted to be in a place where she's just simply living like everybody else or some other groups of people who have found a way to just simply live and exist fully without that constant struggle.
Again, thank you, Donna, for joining us today. And like Keshua prefaced her comments, I have to preface mine by just saying quickly that I really appreciated this work. I appreciate the work, and I mean, I resonate with it. Have a set of third grandparents who immigrated from Haiti. Actually, one was born in Cuba, left Haiti. One was born in Cuba, and both immigrated to New Orleans. So this story really captured me, and I want to dig deeper in my own past about this. But my question is about your historical research, and particularly the novel describes advertisements in the Daily Gleaner newspaper enticing workers to Cuba in the early 20th century. Did you find advertisements similar to the ones you describe in the Gleaner archives? So would you mind telling us about your historical research methods, please?
Sure. I spent a good number of days at the Library of Congress going through old newspapers on microfiche and really looking for a lot of the stories. And so that's how I came across the advertisements that were there that really, like were encouraging people to come. And there were quite a bit of ads. Yeah, just basically getting people to go to different ports, or people advertising, or in some ways telling them who to trust and who not to trust. And so in addition to the ads, there were also a lot of articles, which, like some with the headlines like "Get out of there now."
Mm,
Like if you're thinking about going to Cuba, don't. So there were a lot of, over the years, there were a lot of different articles and opinion pieces that really showed some of what that experience was like. There were, during that time period, early like 1917, 18, 19, there were a number of revolts. And so there were some people who were talking about that experience, what it was like for them. And then when we got to like 1920, there were, like still other issues because the entire market crashed. So, a lot of the research that I did, or a lot of what I found, was really coming from newspaper articles and some academic texts as well.
And just to add on that, I was wondering if you also relied on oral history, the stories that you got from your grandparents, your parents, family members, Jamaicans who have a similar experience.
Well, with my family, I tried, but my father, of course, didn't remember anything. I got some from one of my uncles, but I think, a lot of it is just the distance of time. And the kinds of questions that I would ask as a writer are not necessarily the kinds of questions that they would have asked their parents. So, what I really wanted was, like if I could go back in time and ask my grandparents, what their experience was like, that's what I wanted to know. But it's the way it is.
And I mean, to add to that, in our reflections, we were sort of pondering on whether you wanted us to think of segments of the book as reality or just Perline reminiscing or dreaming on certain things, and whether it was just her imagination. So, my question is, why do you rely so heavily on dreams and family lore in telling the story in this novel?
Well, the thing is that I really wanted to tell what happened in Cuba. And Perline was 3 years old when she came back to Jamaica. So there was no way in which she could have told a lot of those stories, but she would, at least not from her own experience, but she could have told the stories that her parents told her, or that she gathered through various conversations that, family have when you're sitting around. And so I think there are two things that were happening there. Now that her father was dead, she was also feeling guilty about not fulfilling his wish. So I think there is, within the dreams, there is some of it is guilt, some of it is just her trying to figure out what it is that she needs to do. And I think that was just the best way to get that kind of thing across, just based on the fact that, one, it's Jamaica. There are lots of people who still believe in spirits, and people coming back to them and dream, and what you're dreaming, what you're experiencing through that dream. And so I think it really just reflects the culture, as well as that sense of guilt that she felt about not fulfilling her father's wish.
Yeah, certainly. If it feels like we're talking lots of historical questions, Eric and I are both working historians, and so I got really excited about how your methodology was. But I'm just going to kind of pick up on what you were saying about guilt and wonder about the legacy of grief in the novel, which it feels like is kind of really important to Pearline, and she thinks it's something that is part of their legacy as an extended family. And if you could just talk us through that, really, from your perspective, is that, have we read that wrong? Is that something that you did want to bring out?
Yeah, that was something that was a part of it. And, I think it's, I guess, as a people are, I think, still grieving. I mean, all of us, regardless of, where we landed in the, Western world, there is still a lot of that grief that we might not be aware of, like as a part of it, or part of our lives, or that we're living with. And I think that was something that Pearline realized, that like what had happened to her family in Cuba. One, they lost a child. Her parents lost a child very young. She lost a brother. So there was that grief. And then there was the grief of leaving your country and going to Panama, and uncle who came back and, like went mad. So there was a lot of grief in the family. And there are also lots of things that were not necessarily said in the family because people were grieving and you didn't necessarily want to bring it up. And so I think just generally, when I even look at my own family, there are lots of things that we don't talk about. And I think that is part of the process where you set it aside and you move on. You try not to think about or keep those negative things, or bring them forward. And I think that is all part of this whole process of grieving and of trying to find a way to move forward out of whatever it is in the past that you really want to leave behind.
So I'm going to shift a little bit and move to the character Derek. So Derek is Perline's previously unknown nephew, fathered by Victor,
Mhm.
who was Rupert's son that she didn't know about. Uh, so, was it of any particular importance to you to integrate Derek intimately into Perline's life, and that of the wider family's life? You also did something. You also do something with Claudia, Perline's 5-year-old distant cousin. So, um, why did you choose that line there?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One, it feels like very Caribbean to me, or at least very Jamaican, where there are random people who pop up in your life and you take care of them because they're family. But I think there are two other things that work for Pearline specifically. One is that she has come back to Jamaica and she's looking at this land and this house as a place from which her family members can never be removed, a place where if you come back, you will always be welcome. And so when Derek shows up, she really has to question and ask herself whether she would turn him away. And if she turns him away, is she fulfilling this wish of her parents to have a house that is solely theirs, a place where any family member can show up and they will not be turned away? So that's one part of it. The second part of it is that she is also feeling guilty about what she did to her own daughter and how she encouraged her daughter not to pursue her dreams in film. And now she has a second opportunity to do all the things that she hadn't done with her daughter, both with Derek and with Claudia, because now I think she is reliving her life as a mother and doing some of the things that she hadn't been able to do, partly because she was just simply so busy working and trying to exist in America.
Oh, may I have a follow up on that?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
And can I one after you?
Okay. Um, it's related, uh, but a little bit further um, down the line of inquiry. But you situated uh, Perline in Brooklyn, and as well you situated Derek in Brooklyn. That's their context before they pop up in Jamaica. Why did you choose Brooklyn? And I know that's a center of Jamaican American community, but it's also South Florida, uh, the other places as well. But why Brooklyn in particular?
I lived in Brooklyn for about 8 years, so it's I know Brooklyn in some ways, and I tend to try to write about places that I know.
Okay, good.
Caswell?
Kind of on the same theme, like I've been to Brooklyn a handful of times, so I don't know at all as well. I've been down the North End Avenue and I've had Trini food there rather than Jamaican food. But I guess the question is, one of the conversations that we were thinking was, how likely is it that two members of the same family could be in Brooklyn and never cross paths? Could she really not know of her own brother and his child in the same small part of New York, or is Brooklyn big enough that that is possible?
I mean, Brooklyn is big enough that that is possible, and I mean, even I can tell you, even in Jamaica, it's more than possible. You could live in the same neighborhood and not know that this person down the street is your brother or your sister, and I have heard of that, and I know of that in several cases. So I mean, Brooklyn is pretty big, and there are lots of little neighborhoods, and just there is almost no way that you would meet all of the Caribbean people or all of the Jamaican people in one neighborhood. I think, like even for the family in Jamaica, I think there was some conversations. Her sisters in Jamaica seem to have known a little bit more about her father's exploits than Pearline did, because she had left Jamaica for so many years earlier. So I think it was a little bit easier for them to accept. I mean, it was easy for all of them to accept, but I think her sisters had a little bit more knowledge just based on the fact that they were in a smaller community and probably saw and heard a lot more than Pearline did.
And I'm gonna steal a second follow-up question. Forgive me, Roger. I really liked what you did with the character Derek, in that you had him as a young man, a little bit lost. And it kind of contrasted with the image I think we sometimes have of these hardened criminals who return deported from the US, who ruin otherwise tranquil rural areas with their knowledge of criminality. It felt like that you were going against that kind of stereotype of kind of American rubbish, and I'm using inverted commas very strongly, being dashed in the Caribbean and ruining it. And actually the Caribbean being a place that he was already familiar with. It wasn't a first time, he wasn't a newcomer, but also he was a blessing to Pauline. He looked after her when she was sick. He was a big brother to this child that needed love. He was cooking and cleaning, and it was a very like a rounded picture of a young man who'd got caught up in the wrong crowd. And Pearline was able to see that, perhaps because she'd lived in Brooklyn, perhaps because she was just in a different phase of life where she was kind of more open to these things. And have I read that completely wrong? Is that something you were deliberately trying to do to kind of work on that stereotype, or was it just something that I was overthinking, which does happen?
I will fully accept your explanation. When I wrote him, what I was really looking at is more the sense that he was trying to find a place for himself, and he knew that if he messed up, he would have nowhere to go. But I like your explanation as well, and so I think it can be both.
That's very generous of you. Thank you.
I actually wanted to delve into the title of the novel, because so far we've explored that this family was all about secrets, and I think that's quite common in the Caribbean for family members to hold secrets and not share information with each other. And we got that sense with Pearline being completely in the dark, and Hermina and Eileen knew pretty much everything and kept things from Pearline. So what led to the title of this novel, The House of Plain Truth? Because it seems quite paradoxical or ironic.
I think, well, the title changed several times. And I think once we landed on that, it made sense, because the house was at the center of the story. And the house is what held the secrets, or was the answer to figuring out a lot of what happened in the family, or how things played out in the family. But, and I think it was a name that the mother, Irene, actually gave to the property. And I think she did that because she knew all of what had happened, that she was just continuing to hide. So it's hard to talk about the title without talking too much about the story for those people who haven't read it. So I will just simply say that I think once you read the book, or you understand what is happening in the story and what the secrets are about, then you'll fully understand the title, and it will make perfect sense.
Pearline, just come back to her character. We learn a lot about the family through her eyes, really, and through the vision she has as dreams. And we hear less of the sisters' points of view in some respects. Like, they have their own vibe, and they're kind of their sibling energy. And one of the things that we kind of thought about when we were doing the review program was Pearline is clearly a different kind of returnee, if you like, from those who want to build a house on the hill, who want to live in a kind of expaty type community, although they were once regular Jamaicans like everybody else. And we talked about people who left with no education, came back with a qualification in being abroad, and come back as the experts and everything. And so it was interesting to contrast her and her vision of what happened with her migration with Derek, Derek, the child, the son who has a second chance at life in some respects because he's migrated in the other direction, right? If he can follow his art school dreams, migration will be good for him as well. The question then is, do you think we hear too much from Pearline's side of the story of what it means to be a returnee and the kind of shunning that she experiences? Not too much, that's not the right phrasing. What I mean is, Pearline is obviously a different kind of returnee. Does she buck all the trends of all returnees, do you think, because she's from the countryside? Because this is a story that doesn't take place sort of in Kingston or in a big kind of metropolis area. It's a very kind of local, what feels like quite a rural setting. Is that why she bucks the trend, or have the sisters just read her wrong because she's been away for so long they've lost track of who each other are?
I think it's more that the sisters have read her wrong. I don't think she's a different kind of returnee. A lot of the people who I know who wanted to go back to Jamaica, or at least generationally, when I go back and look at and listen to my parents' generation, for example, there are so many people who wanted to go back to the place where they grew up. They are nostalgic about that particular house and that particular life. And so there are some people who want to go back to that. And then there are others who, I just simply don't want to return to that kind of hard life and want to move up to something else, to that big house on the hill overlooking the sea, because that, as they were growing up, was their idea of what it was to be wealthy and successful. So I think that is where Pearline is coming from. What her goal is to do what her father wasn't able to do and build upon that family land. But I think to her sisters want something else, because what they see that land and farming as is hardship as opposed to something that is liberating. And for Pearline, it's the opposite.
Okay. Yeah, I think that reminds me a little bit of my grandparents. I think they very much went back and built their home that they didn't have before they left, but they nostalgic for after 30 years in England. So I definitely recognize that character. Thank you.
Thanks.
Eric?
Okay, a similar vein, but again, a little shift. You mentioned almost casually troublesome issues like the strange duality of tourist towns where spaces meant for tourists are given care and attention, which is not lavished or on spaces occupied by citizens. You do something similar when you mention familial relationships between enslaved people and enslavers. Why did you address those matters in an almost offhand manner?
Offhand, I'm not sure I would say offhand, but I think each book serves a different purpose, and I think that in this case, I wanted to mention those things, but I don't think that's what the book was necessarily about. And if I went into deeper any more depth about those issues in this book, it would become something else altogether. So I think talking about tourism, for example, its impact on the Caribbean, its impact on people who live in the Caribbean, really requires its own place, its own exploration. Maybe whether it's a book or an article, that really just requires something else bigger. And it might not be for me as a fiction writer to tell that story. And maybe there is a way for me to tell that story as a fiction writer, but that's for another project, hopefully.
Ooh, I would say that you are well equipped to address those issues. Maybe, yes, definitely. Maybe not in fiction, but let's say a op-ed in the Washington Post or a New York Times or something like that, or even the 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 Chicago Defender or the
Right.
Pittsburgh Courier or the Baltimore Afro American. Uh, but I think you're equipped to do that, and I think that is speaking from an African American perspective and also a person who has Caribbean ancestry. This is something that African Americans need to hear about, because I'm on a soapbox right now, so just bear with me, y'all. Because now, if you're African American, you got two dimes to rub together. You're always going down to the Dominican or to Jamaica to vacation, but you don't realize that you are compounding some problems, some issues that are going on. And again, this is my Pan African spirit coming out as well. So I would encourage you, if you have the time, in the next few months or next 6, 7, 8 months, that you could delve into that.
I know you didn't think you were coming here for homework, Donna, but this is how we roll.
That's fine. Maybe I just need the encouragement. So thank you.
Yeah, and to build on what Eric was saying as well, my paternal grandmother was born in the Dominican Republic to cane cutters,
Mhm.
and definitely from my own perspective, we've never had the story of the struggles that migrants had in Cuba, in the Dominican Republic, in Panama. Particularly in Panama, we know of the many deaths that um, Caribbean people suffered there while building the Panama Canal. So I was really glad that this novel brought out the, if you want to call it, dark side of migration to these places, because you do mention the Cologne man in the novel, where people get this flashy impression. People come back in suits and they make it seem like life over there was wonderful. For some people that was true. Some people did come back a lot wealthier than they left, but others did not have such wonderful experiences. And I think Rupert's experience was like that. Did you want to give us both sides of the coin of the sort of intra-Caribbean migration stories of the early 20th century?
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of it too is that I had just never heard a lot of these stories. Like you said, we have heard the flashy part. I can't remember the name of the song, but uh, there is a song about the Kulon man coming back and his gold watch and stuff like that. And that's what we heard. That's all that I remember hearing as a child, whether it was in history classes or anything, was just, like people went to Panama to help build the canal, but nothing else. Like I also heard, like people went to Cuba, but nothing else about what those experiences were like. So, I mean, I was really surprised. In particular, there was, like that in the early 1900s, the American government had to petition the Cuban government to allow Black people to move into Cuba, because at that point the only people who were allowed to migrate to Cuba were white, and particularly Spanish people. And so, because they were doing that in order to lighten the race. And so it was quite surprising to me and disturbing in a lot of ways to know that that was happening in Cuba, 90 miles away from Jamaica, without learning any of that and without having any understanding about what it really was like for people when they were moving to work in Cuba and cut cane, or across the Caribbean in whether it was farming or helping to build the Panama Canal. So there are just so many other stories that I think we need to understand and appreciate what it is that our family members, our friends, or like fellow countrymen and women have actually endured in order to exist.
I mean, we would never disagree with that. More stories that are Caribbean and Black, absolutely. I think the question I'll have is, what would you like your readers who've never learned anything about this period in history to take away from your novel?
I think a large part of it is what Perline said about this constant struggle. That I think everywhere we are as a people, we are, whether it's in the Caribbean or even here in America, or in England, we are all just really struggling to exist. And I think it's a universal story for all of us, regardless of where you are. And I think sometimes that we get caught up in where we live or where we're from and whose struggle is worse than the other, that I don't think we recognize that all of us are struggling and all of our people have struggled, and that we continue to struggle. So I think that if you take that away from it and you're able to look at that other people, um, like with a little bit more empathy and understanding, that certainly would be great. But I also really hope that it opens up people or allows people to have more conversations with their family members about what their own experiences were like. Because I think so many of us younger people take for granted this idea that our parents or our grandparents or great grandparents have gone out in the world, or whether they have moved to America or whether they moved to another country. Like we just know that they went, but we don't fully appreciate and understand their experience. And I think it will make us and our stories richer if we have a better understanding of what, um, like our own family members experience.
Yeah, I definitely sense the generosity of spirit that you kind of request, really, like you expect that, and then you call for, which is it's beautiful. It was
Thank you.
lovely. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you for that point. And based upon that point, uh, there is a section in the novel where uh, there's some violence that is being perpetrated against Haitians in particular,
Mhm.
and Rupert is afraid because he doesn't want his sons to go out into the streets thinking that they may be mistaken as Haitians. Um, was this something deliberate that you did, or was that something that you saw in your archival research? This anti-Haitian animus that was taking place in Cuba, or again, or did you create this? Did you imagine this?
Not at all. That was actually from the material. And, one of the things that everything that I've read have said that Haitians were treated a lot worse in Cuba than people from any other island. And I don't remember the numbers right now, but there were, when the Cuban government decided to deport or to repatriate a lot of the migrant laborers, the first group of people they started with were Haitians, and and I think some of that had to do with the fact that the Jamaican government or governments from the English-speaking Caribbean had a stronger presence or a stronger impact on helping their citizens return. And I don't think that was the same for Haitians. So I really wish I had the numbers, but there were a lot of Haitians that were simply deported. They were rounded up and deported. And the incident in the book that I think you're referring to was again one of those instances where they specifically came for Haitian migrants to return them, and then they were then coming back or saying that they were coming back for some of the Jamaicans afterwards. So it's one of those things that I think was just very difficult to read in some ways. That when you continue to look at and to see that some groups of people are considered um, to be, I don't want to say worse, but in some ways that's what it was, are considered to be less than some of the other migrant workers. And so they were just simply treated, just much worse. One of the other things that I remember reading too was that some migrants were simply, when they were picked up and rounded up to be deported, they were simply put on a ship and landed in a completely different country from the one where they were from. And that was just simply because they just didn't care. They were picking up people and just simply deporting them, as opposed to trying to figure out where they really were from.
And why does I mean, it throughout the novel, reading it, I kept thinking back, and you even made references to this. I kept thinking about the transatlantic slave trade,
Mhm.
and like this is just a continuation of the trauma of the transatlantic slave trade, the trauma of enslavement in the Americas, and now in this post slavery moment, this post emancipation
Mhm.
moment, the same things are happening, but in slightly nuanced ways. There's still this anti-black animus in like the Hispano Caribbean and definitely in the United States as well. Um, so I mean, I think again I want to turn this into a question, but was this something that you was working through deliberately, and as you were writing, you're working this out and you're expanding the story?
Yeah, I think everything that happens is a continuation of that, of this transatlantic slave trade, and a continuation of just this idea that as a people we are less than, and that we should be treated worse than any other group of people. And it continues. It shows up in so many different ways. And I think this was part of it. That in Cuba we were just simply treated badly for various reasons. Some of it had to do with the economic situation. Some of it had to do with the fact that America was expanding its imperial, like its self, across, various regions. And the Cuban people, I think, were fighting for their land, fighting for their like sovereignty, if you will. And and I think in some ways that we, us, the migrants coming in, were the people who felt the brunt of that. Um, and I think that happened then. It continues to happen now, where there are groups of people who continue to say that these people who are coming in are coming to take away what is yours. It happened then in Cuba. It is happening now in America. It's happening in other countries. And I think it's just this continuation, that there is always this need to find somebody else who you want to put at the bottom. And I think Isabel Wilkerson in Caste, really looks at it as that we have we as a people like to put people in different groups or different castes. And so there is always somebody who you're putting at the bottom of the caste. So that is the person that you're either stepping on or beating down. And I think this is the situation. That is the continuation of that whole idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we've made it sound really heavy, and your novel is actually not heavy to read. It's a real pleasure. It's light. It's beautifully written. It's lyrical. There's so much love in it, for family, for individuals that they have no reason to really break their backs for, but they do take each other in. They care for each other, and I think kind of one thing that I really enjoyed about the novel and that came out in that conversation is how much it also visually, graphically, almost in my mind, reminded me of the Farming of Bones. You pick up some of the not just the themes, obviously the massacre of Haitians on the Dominican border, but also the way that it's lived in individual lives, if you like, the way that people and families and couples experience a moment of real terror and the choices that they're forced to make in those moments, and how they then rebuild after them, in particular. And when I say people, I probably mean Black people who have experienced enslavement and other traumas. And so it's another trauma piled on that they have to work through, as opposed to a flash in the pan, unusual, this is so crazy, this is a once in a historical moment for us kind of experience. It's kind of an add-on as opposed to something unique and exceptional in some respects. How hard was that to write a novel that was both beautiful and uplifting and joyous, whilst tackling really difficult themes of genocide, and contextualizing anti-Blackness of a period when we've often thought about it, and I include myself in the us, as this terrible thing that happened in Haiti in 1937, when actually 1937 is the same year that in Bermuda they try and sterilize Black people, like legally, that's the thing they try and do. So, there's a rise of fascism, yes, but Black people experience it in quite particular ways, and it's not a flash in the pan as we're often kind of led to believe. That's a really heavy question, but I hope you can make something of it and keep trying.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult in a lot of ways, because I think, certainly for me, that a large part of it was trying to reading and understanding the history, and in some ways making it a part of my life, so it becomes part of the story, but it's not necessarily the where as a reader you're reading about the people, but you're not just reading about history. And that is it takes a lot of work to go through all of that material and to figure out what to leave out, what to include, and how to include it, how to personalize it in a way that makes it about the people and about this particular family, as opposed to just a generalized statement. And it's work, it's massaging in some ways, like what the material that you have. And and I think that's a large part of why this book just took me such a long time to write, because I started writing this book in 2006 and set it aside for several years, because it just took some time to figure out how best to tell this story and who should be telling this story.
And to end the interview, I want to take you to the final pages of the novel. You ended the novel on something of a cliffhanger. You did the same thing in River Woman and Tea by the Sea. Can you talk us through that creative choice?
Yeah, I've heard people call it a cliffhanger, but I don't think of it as a cliffhanger. And I think there are two things. One, like I like what Toni Morrison said, that like the reader has to do some of the work. And so I think what I do in the in each of these three books is give you, the reader, enough so that you know what happens next. I don't also like books where everything is just neatly tied up and you just, like add a little bow and that's it. And, everybody lives happily ever after. That, that kind of story or that kind of end doesn't necessarily work for me. But I think that, I'll talk a little bit more about Tea by the Sea as opposed to The House of Plain Truth, or the end of it, because, I think more people have had a chance to read Tea by the Sea. The Plum, the main character there, has been searching for a daughter for 17 years. And when she does find her daughter, I think there's only so many things that can happen at the end of that novel. Either the child goes with her or she doesn't go with her. And I think that what you see at the end of that book, where the child is running after the car because the mother is in the police car at that point, to me, that tells you exactly what happens next. That it's not a cliffhanger to me. I think that when you read that, where the child and the mother end up. It's not with the father, it's with the mother. And I think it's the same thing in The House of Plain Truth, that there is enough there for you to know what happens next. And I won't say anything more than that.
I think that's a wonderful way to end. Thank you so much for joining us today, Donna. It was a lovely interview. We had a lovely reflection on your novel as well. Uh, Before I introduce the reading, I'd like our viewers to know that the next book we'll be reflecting on is The Human Origins of Beatrice Porter and Other Essential Ghosts by Soraya Palmer. You could read it and you could follow our discussions when that time comes. But for now, we'll take you out with a reading by Donna Hemans. Thank you for joining us.
Now, looking at her sisters, hearing of their plan, Pearlie knows that her father's request is something that she has to hold close. He chose her. How long he must have waited for her to come home. She'd seen it often with patients who lingered after life support was turned off, hanging on until a parent, a sibling, a spouse, a child arrived, seeming to give up only then. She knows her father waited and wonders if he'd always known she would come home. Her decision to come home was based on something else, not her ailing father, not a selfless desire to help her sisters care for him. 30 years living in Brooklyn, and still she was seen only as an immigrant, an other. Her accent, the lilt in her tongue, and the little green card with resident alien stamped across the top, forever marking her as one who doesn't belong. She hated the word alien. No matter how anyone used it, whether permanent resident alien or illegal alien, the image she thought of was non-human, elongated head and bulging eyes, an othered being who couldn't be integrated at all. Otherness was a burden, complicated by the various descriptors news reporters and the people she encountered used for people like her. That year, the popular descriptor was both people, and she hated it for the way it reduced refugees to that single moment when they were found adrift at sea, and the rest of their story, their lives before the decision to board an ill-equipped boat and cross the rough seas, their identities, fishermen, seamstresses, farmers, mechanics, shopkeepers, struggling students, class clowns, reduced to that single moment. Their lives after, whether they were worthy of refuge and rescue, also evaporated in the fight over who would take them in or to whom they would be returned. It was no longer about them, the refugees, but about how their would be rescuer nations wanted to be seen as a blinking lighthouse that guides and saves, or a mirage of one. Repatriation was a third term she hated. It too reduced the lives of the repatriated to the single political moment when they were rounded up and returned, unwelcome castaways no longer wanted by a nation that had once welcomed them. The work they had done for their adopted country and the lives they had built no longer mattered. All that mattered was that they were other. Perline had been two of those. First, a repatriated child born in Cuba to Jamaican migrants, expelled from the country of her birth and raised in Jamaica from age 4. And later, a migrant to America, a permanent resident alien who made a life in Brooklyn. Repatriation is the one that stings most, for her family's ultimate dismissal from Cuba was a stain on her father's life. But now, Perline thinks something else brought her back. Her father wanted her back. He had prolonged his dying and waited for her to come. She is sure of that. She tells herself again that he chose her and not her sisters to hear his last words. Find them for me. You are my memory now. One is her charge, the other her legacy, both intertwined and impossible to deny.